Hey everyone, so today we're going to have a chat about the difference between modern and historic Tameshigiri. So to start with, what is Tameshigiri? Well, in essence, Tameshigiri is you get your cutting stand, you get your cutting target, you plonk one on top of the other, and you get your sword and you chop it up. In essence, that's what Tameshigiri is. But what's the point of doing that? And I think there's a few different answers depending on the practitioner and the person, and it ranges from masters who have been training for decades, testing their skill and demonstrating techniques on cutting targets, compared to amateurs who have bought their first sword and they're just trying to see what it can do and they're chopping up things in their backyard, and both are fine, and there's everything in between as well. So what sort of targets are used for Tameshigiri? Well, modern targets, then we can often see people cutting bottles. You see me use pool noodles a lot. Newspapers are a great target, things like that. And more historic targets, some of which are still used today, include tatami mats, bamboo and straw bales. But there's an interesting historic target that I want to talk about, which is humans. So why use humans as Tameshigiri targets? It seems grotesque, it seems morbid, it seems so horrific. But I think we've got to go back to the historic period, and from the Edo period this was pretty commonplace, and why this was done was because swords back then were used to kill humans. And so you could use tatami mats to emulate human flesh, you could use bamboo to emulate human bone, but nothing would really emulate a human as well as a human. And so to test how well your sword works against humans, you tested it on a human, and that was the end of it. So they often use convicted criminals or dead convicts, and they'd do certain cuts through the convicts, and they'd see how many they could go through. Now this was actually so commonplace in the Edo period that there's a well-known story about a criminal who, when he found out that he'd be condemned to death by Tameshigiri, joked that he should have been told earlier so that he could swallow some large stones to intentionally damage the blade. And so we see that this is pretty widespread throughout historic Japanese culture. Now, why do historic targets differ so drastically from modern targets? I think there's a pretty big difference in the reason why Tameshigiri is done. So in modern times, Tameshigiri is done to test the skill of the user. And so you can show skill of using a sword by cutting through a bottle, you can show skill by cutting through a pool noodle, but historic Tameshigiri is very different from that. Historic Tameshigiri did not actually aim to test the skill of the user. It aimed to test the sword and put the sword under stresses and show that the sword was built correctly and it was a proper sword that would hold up to various stresses. And having a sword cut through pool noodles, cut through bottles, it doesn't actually show much about the structural integrity of the sword. And so buying a sword in historic times was quite a risky affair because you didn't know that you were going to get a good sword. Steel back then wasn't like modern steel where it's quite homogeneous, very high quality. They made their own steel and impurities were added, impurities weren't taken out, and you didn't know that your sword would actually hold up to the stresses of use. And the way that you would find out if you didn't have a trusted swordsman to test your sword would be that you would parry another blade in a life or death duel and your sword would break on you and you would be in big trouble and you would see the afterlife. So Tameshigiri was done by swordsmen who had exceptional skill. Their skill was not in question, and they would test out these swords. And the owner of the sword would pay quite a lot of money to have the sword tested by these practitioners. And if the sword did well, then it would have a Tameshigiri engraved on it. And that would multiply the sword's value many times because it essentially said, this sword did well in Tameshigiri. It is guaranteed to be a good sword, and it was like a certificate of authenticity that this was a quality blade. And in modern times, then in Japan, the Tameshigiri covers both. It's an umbrella term talking about test cutting, and it doesn't differentiate between test cutting to show the user's skill or test cutting to show the sword's prowess. And so in modern times, then there's two different words that they actually use to refer to that. So they use shizan, which is testing the user's skill, to refer to modern Tameshigiri, and they use shito, which is testing the sword, to refer to the historic practice of testing what the sword can do by doing Tameshigiri. Now in modern times, it's actually really interesting because the amateur buying their first sword, doing destructive testing and chopping up whatever they can in their backyard is actually pretty close to historic Tameshigiri because they're testing to see what the sword can do. And you know, the skill level isn't quite the same as the practitioner. They're not an exceptional swordsman where the skill is not in doubt. But it's pretty cool because it's pretty close to history and it catches the same essence. If you've never tried Tameshigiri and you're a capable swordsman at the right skill level, then I highly recommend you do, because you can practice your whole life cutting through the air and practicing your forms, but if you don't cut through a target, you don't know that you have the good edge alignment to cut through a target, you don't know that you can accelerate through a target properly, then you'll never know until you try. And I think you can't really say you're a good swordsman until you've done some Tameshigiri, because there's no point to being perfect in your form if you can't cut through a target. So I highly recommend that you try it. It's good, it's a lot of fun, and also it'll build your skills and expand your skill repertoire. So with that, I hope you like that, and I'll see you next time.